Hello everyone, Mr. Geiselhart here, and we're going to be talking about the rules of exponents. Most, if not all, this stuff should be review for you, but then we're going to probably extend it just a little bit from what you've done before to get into some a little bit more complicated questions. The first rule we're going to talk about is the product rule, and that just basically means if you have x to the a times x to the b, it's equal to x to the a plus b. A couple of things we need to note here. The bases need to be the same. In other words, the numbers being raised to the exponent have to be the same, or the variables raised to the exponent has to be the same. And then the exponents up here are just added together. So for example, if you had y to the fourth times y to the fifth, you'd have y to the 4 plus 5, which is y to the ninth. Now, another example where a lot of students make a mistake is if you have a number in there. If we had like 3 to the fourth times 3 to the 10th. Now this number might be too big to just put in your calculator and get an answer. So what we would do is just add the exponents. Now, some people will get the answer of 3 to the 14th. Other people will say, well, if this is 3 to the 4th times 3 to the 10th, I have to do 3 times 3, which is 9 to the 14th. So which one of these do you think is correct? Well, to answer that question, let's look back at our y. Notice that I had a y here and a y here, and I still just have one y here, but I'm still just adding those. And so in that case, I should have a 3 here, a 3 here, so that means I should have a 3 here as well. The other way of thinking about it is 3 to the 4th means I have 4 3's being multiplied together. And then 3 to the 10th means I have 10 3's being multiplied together. So if I were to go ahead and if I were to add or multiply all those 3's together, that would mean I would have 14 3's, or 3 to the 14th power. If I did this, that would mean I would have 14 9's being multiplied together, which we're not doing here. We're multiplying 14 3's. So be careful when you have the numbers that you don't multiply the numbers together, you just add the exponents. The next thing we're going to look at is the quotient rule, and as you can see here, I don't have the quotient rule written up here, so let's go ahead and write that in. It just means y to the a over y to the b is equal to y to the a minus b. So when we look at the example, if you have y to the 7th over y to the 5th, you just take 7 minus 5 and you're left with y squared. Now, what happens if you were to have something like y to the 5th over y to the 7th, and that equals y to the 5 minus 7, that would give you y to the negative 2. So you're going to do it the same way. Now, generally speaking, we don't like to leave negative exponents in our answers, and I'll address that in a later time. Okay, taking a look at the zero exponent. The zero exponent just means anytime you take a number to the 0 power, it's equal to 1, no matter what that number is, except for 0. You can't have 0 to the 0 power. That is undefined. But anything to the 0 power is equal to 1. And let me just kind of illustrate that for you here as to why that might be. If we were to look at the quotient rule, that was something like y to the 5th over y to the 5th. If I subtract my exponents, that would just be y to the 5 minus 5, which is y to the 0 power. Well, another way of looking at that, anything over itself is equal to 1. So that's just saying that anything to the 0 power is equal to 1. Okay, now we're going to take a look at negative exponents. And a negative exponent pretty basically just means if it's on top, you put it on bottom. If it's on bottom, you put it on top. And you can kind of see where that comes from, because if you were to do something like x to the 2nd over x to the 3rd, you would get something like x to the 2 minus 3, which would equal x to the negative 1. And basically, we're just going to take and put that 1 over x to the 1st power. And that makes sense, because if you look at what x squared over x to the 3rd means, it means x times x over x times x times x. So if you were to cancel out your x's, that would just leave you with 1 over x. So it kind of makes sense that you should do it that way. The other thing you can think of for moving it to from the bottom to the top is if you had something like, let's just say 1 over x to the negative 3. Or actually, let's pick a different example. I don't like that one. Let's say x squared over x to the negative 3. Now, this x to the negative 3 on bottom, if I were to go ahead and put that in my quotient rule, it would be 2 minus a negative 3. So then that would equal x to the positive 5th, so that would be my answer. So basically, x to the negative 3 is the same thing as saying x squared times x to the third, so I would add those, which gives me x to the 5th. Next, we're going to have the power to the power rule. To do the power to the power rule, you just multiply the exponents. So if you're taking something raised to a power and then raise it to a power again, you multiply them. So x to the 4 to the 5th is equal to x to the 4 times 5, which is x to the 20th. Now, all of the negative exponent rules still apply. So if you had x to the 5th, x to the 5th raised to the negative 4th, that would be x to the negative 20th, which would just be 1 over x to the 20th. And now we're going to take a look at fractional exponents. Fractional exponents are just another way of writing roots. So if you have x to the a divided by b, that's the same thing as saying the square root, or actually not the square root, I'm sorry. Whatever b is, that root, x raised to the a power. Now, I want you to know that this is the same thing, or it's equivalent to saying, if I take the b root of x, all of that raised to the a power. Those two things are equivalent statements. So when I look at this one here, what I want to do is I want to look at x to the 4 over 3. That's just the cube root of x to the 4th. So another example of this might be something like 25 to the 3/2 power. That equals the square root of 25 raised to the 3rd power. Well, the square root of 25 is just going to be 5. So that's 5 to the 3rd power, which is 125. So these you can actually get an answer for if it is a number when you're doing that. You can also use your calculator if it's a number just by simply entering in the fraction as the exponent.